One's patience. The upcoming conversation is going to be interesting because I'm thinking we might be having our youngest facilitator in the next coming up session. Might be wrong, stand ready to be corrected, but yes. John, are you here with us?
Yes, I am, but of all days,
There
we are. It works.
It's there.
Oh, phew.
Ah,
Okay.
ooh,
So we're here. We're
yay.
here. Phew.
Fantastic.
Okay. Okay. So with me is okay, I'm gonna be like that faded dad, helicopter dad in the background. With me today is my 13-year-old daughter, Christabel. And I'll let her take the introductions and facilitate the session. Thank you.
Thank you. So later on, please feel free to type your questions in the chat, and if time permits, we'll go through the questions. Our speaker of the hour is Cesar John Harada, and he is a French-Japanese designer, environmentalist, educator, and entrepreneur, passionate about ocean technology, impact innovation, and education based in Singapore. Cesar is an associate professor of design at the Singapore Institute of Technology. Cesar is currently a candidate PhD in design and ocean innovation at the CNAM, which is in France. Cesar is a former MIT researcher and project leader, TED Senior Fellow, Good 100, IBM Figure of Progress, Unreasonable at Sea Fellow, Shuttleworth Foundation, and Ocean Exchange grantee. He believes that nature, human, and technology can coexist in harmony. Today, Cesar will be sharing with us about ocean futures. Let's welcome Prof. Cesar.
Thanks so much for having me. So I just put a timer for 45 minutes. Is that what you're looking for, right? 45 minutes to speak and then 15 minutes of discussion. Is that the format? 5 minutes of discussion afterwards. Okay. Or 40 minutes. Okay. So I'll change the timer to 40 minutes. Okay.
Sorry, 40 minutes because I was delaying the whole session by 5 minutes. Yeah, thank you.
Makes sense. Okay, so I'll be sharing my screen if that's okay. You need to give me permission to share my screen. Maybe you need to make me co-host, perhaps. Okay, now I can. Okay, thank you. Share my screen, share the sound with high fidelity if possible. Okay, do you guys see my screen? Can you see my screen? Okay, perfect, thank you. All right. Okay. All right, so thanks so much for having me. So this talk is really aimed at young people, especially the young people that have a lot of dream and are thinking a lot about the future, which I count myself in. So I'll start by using this quote. I think it's very, very important, is that imagination is more important than knowledge. And so when you think about the future, of course, you're using your knowledge. That's why you're going to school. That's why you're studying. But you also need to not forget your imagination, because I think personally it's actually the more important things. Because if you can't imagine the future, what you could do, then there's no way you're going to get there unless it's an accident. But I would say it's unlikely that you get like a lucky accident if you don't think about the future. So I think it's important to think about the future a lot so that you can do things in the present that are pushing us in this right direction. And so it's also a methodology. There's what we know and the unknown. And anything that you do, if it's a little bit creative, it's going to be an experiment. And in my opinion, it doesn't really matter if you work in the field of science, the field of engineering, the field of design, the field of art. All of these are great contribution. And the reason why I mentioned this is because I think when people think about the future, oftentimes, it's either you're like 100% a scientist and you're doing all these like great discoveries, or you're daydreaming and you're like an artist. But I argued actually it's quite a rigorous process, and it takes a lot of discipline and a lot of knowledge actually to think about the future. And also, maybe if you're now hesitating between careers, there's a social sort of acceptance oftentimes that, science and engineering are like great job and well-paying job, and whereas design and art sort of like inferior professions. But I would argue that this is a very counterproductive way of thinking. You know, that there's a sort of social hierarchy. But I believe that actually, if you want to be a great scientist, you also have to be extremely creative, you know, thinking about new experiments and new setups. And if you want to be a great artist, you also need to know about science. You need to know about material and color theory and perspective and construction. So I would say that actually to be great, you actually need to be open-minded and curious and creative. But I know it's a tall order because society tends to push us towards, you know, those like higher value jobs. But I hope that this presentation I'm going to present to you now is going to make the argument that, you know, art and science are not opposed, but in fact, they are like a long continuum. And present as well in a way that I hope will show that, you know, you can do things in the present that are pointing towards the future that we desire. So let's go towards the future. All right, so I've selected 7 projects. I know it's a lot, but the point is that they all have in common that they are all focused on working with youth, working with future, working on the theme of oceans, which was my big passion, and working towards an improvement of the climate. So working against global warming or climate change. So the first project I did with secondary school students, actually primary school student. From the youngest you can see is holding the yellow nurdle. He's 5 years old, and the oldest one I think was 9 years old. So it was a very mixed class. So my students, I asked them from the beginning. Okay, I put them already in front of a very, very big challenge. I told them that by mid-century, 90% of coral reef will be dead. And by the end of the century, 99% of the coral are expected to be dead. And this is a huge deal because coral are one of the key ecosystem on our planet. Even though they cover like less than 1% of the seafloor, they actually are holding about 25% of the marine biodiversity. So it's a very small area, but so many fish, they reproduce there and they have the larvae or the baby fish or the baby, you know, oysters or a lot of animals basically need those. It's like these are cities basically, yeah, in the ocean. And so right now, if we keep business as usual, we are headed towards something very, very bad. So the first thing I did with my students is I took them snorkeling on a coral reef in Hong Kong. So I used to be based in Hong Kong and work for the Harbor School, which is the little logo in the corner. And so first, the most important thing is to get the students to care and to love the coral. So we swim around and enjoy the beauty of nature, and then we see it. And then I told them, okay, well, the way that we do science right now to map coral reef is that we use this thing called a quadrat. And a quadrat is basically like a square that you put on the coral, and then you have to swim back, take a picture, and the square basically tells you this is 1 meter by 1 meter. What you're looking at is 1 meter by 1 meter. So it's very, very sort of primitive technology that we use. If we keep using this technology to map all the coral reefs in the world, even if we work, you know, 24 hours a day, all the coral basically will be dead before we can scan them, before we can map them. So this technique is not going to cut it. It's not going to work. So I asked my student to take this as a starting point. Use the state of the art. I know you're 10 years old, but it doesn't matter. We look at what is the cutting edge science, and is there something that we could do better? And so I asked my students to start up dreaming up different ideas. And one of the students came up with this idea. What if instead of having a mechanical square, we're projecting a laser? We have a laser quadrat. And so when the students say that, usually the other students will go and they say, oh, what is a stupid idea? You know, we don't believe in it. And then we have to pay really special attention. And you're like, oh, okay, maybe this is not such a stupid idea. Maybe what about we try to prototype it? And so the students had no background in machining and optics, whatever, but immediately they learned by doing. So we went to the local hardware store. We bought those laser devices that they use in construction to align things, which cost like less than $100, and they broke it and they took it apart. So in the process, they learned a little bit of electronics, a little bit of coding. Then they have to make a waterproof case for this laser. So they learn a bit of machining. And then they have to learn a bit of optics because they have to align those lasers and create this mattress. And so this is how they learn optics, again, on the fly. And so after 3 days of work, I called the best scientists doing coral reef science in Hong Kong. And I told them, hello, I'm a teacher and I have the students that have this laser quadrat. And I know you guys do ocean research. Would you be interested in testing a quadrat? And can you come to your lab tomorrow to show it to you at lunch break? And I didn't tell them the age of my students. So they were incredibly surprised. They were all like PhDs and professors. And when they saw those less than teenagers, like that, all these kids like 12 years old came up in their lab, they were kind of shocked. So I kind of like tricked them. And I feel a little bit bad for doing it, but they were really happy to test the technology and see that it actually works. So they tested the laser in the tank. And instead of using calipers to measure coral, they project a laser and they get the pictures that they need much, much faster. So they are super excited about it. And so we asked them, well, you guys are the local scientists. Can you give us a permit to try this device in the wild? And they say, oh, yeah, of course, we have this natural reserve. It's restricted for the public, but we can sign a paper and you can go tomorrow by bus with the school bus, and then you can go and try your device in the open ocean. And so we did. And so we try our device and it works. We are measuring coral reef with this laser quadrant. And so they were flabbergasted. They were amazed that kids, can come up with an idea. And all of them, the stuff that I'm showing to you happens within a week. From Monday, going to snorkel, Tuesday, coming up with an idea, Wednesday, prototyping in the workshop, this laser device. And then Friday, going to the sea again with an actual prototype in the morning. And then in the afternoon of Friday afternoon, we mapped it and we make it instructable, which is a website to document the inventions. And so they were really excited about this. So my students were excited, but they felt also a little bit frustrated because they're like, okay, we can map coral reefs that are dying, but they are still dying. And about a year later, I changed from teaching at the local primary school to teach in university. And one of my students said, I've read this Instructable, which is super interesting to build this laser quadrant. I would love to make this my master thesis project. And so he asked me, could you help me to write a grant? And we wrote a grant, and all these students from computer science, robotics, and mechanical engineering, we got a grant to go to the Philippines. And I choose especially this island because it's got a fast declining coral reef, and it doesn't have internet, which means that it would be a very great place for learning to code and learning to do things yourself instead of just going online. And so my students basically were in this isolated place, and we brought the electronics, but we had to find the material to build a robot in the forest. Students are used to order stuff online, and I told them, no, we're going to take machetes, and machetes, like big knives, and then we took down some bamboo in the forest, and we built our robots made of bamboo. So, and from trash we found on the beach. So the plastic bottles is trash from the beach. Even the wire, we didn't buy wire. We found some bicycle tires on the beach, and then we cut them to make our own thread. And so we built this machine, which is basically a drone, except it's a drone that goes on the water. And there's a camera underneath, a GoPro, and it takes picture every half a second, which is setting you can have on your GoPro. And so we did this first prototype, and it worked okay. The first quadrat, with the square, and it worked okay. But then it was not working as well as we were hoping. And so we continued to do many, many more experiments. And after 1 year of research with this student who, of course, graduated with honors with his thesis, we got some grants from the government to actually map the coral reefs in Hong Kong by the government. And then we wanted to check if we could turn this into a startup. So we wanted to see, could we turn this into a company, because many people are trying to map coral reef. And then every time we did the prototype, we changed a little bit the geometry. So first we have a square, then we have a line, then we have two cameras on the turtle on March 2020. And then we kept improving basically the design every time. Then we are thinking the problem with the coral is that they are typically in shallow waters. And it's very difficult to be precise. If you have a GPS, your GPS always have some imprecision. You may be 3 or 5 meters off because it can't be that precise. So we're trying to find a way to have multiple cameras that are spread apart. So we invented a completely new hardware, completely new boat design, and we also called volunteers. So we had a core team of students, which were my students, and then we had people from the community, maybe fishermen. Some of them were working in consultancy, some of them were accountant, and they just contribute on the weekend. But we really worked as a team to open source the project. And so after 3 years of work, we developed this basically this boat that looked like a ladder, and it's got 5 cameras, and each of them takes a high resolution picture every half a second. And so that means that we take 36,000 pictures every time we get out, and then we can train an AI and we can make super high resolution maps of coral. And now we've trained an AI to classify this coral. And now this AI, in the case of Hong Kong, is more accurate than most marine biology undergrad students. So that's our benchmark. Fast forward a year after my students stopped working on this project, he turned this into a company. So he asked me, hey, Prof, I would love to, I love coral, but I really care about plastic pollution. I went on a holiday in Indonesia, in Bali, and there was so much trash on the beach, I could barely swim. He said, I want to make a company out of this. Instead of tracking coral, I like to track plastic. I would like to collect plastic. I don't want to look at the world, break down. I want to do something with my knowledge to actually clean the world. And so I helped him to make prototypes of this plastic collecting robot. So it's basically the same as the coral reef mapping robot, except this one is optimized to have a big mouth and a big belly and a conveyor belt to store it behind. And so that student studied this company called ClearBots. And so 1.5 years after being graduated, he raised money from Microsoft, from Alibaba, and he was recently featured in Forbes as one of the most promising entrepreneurs under 30 years old. So 1.5 years after he's graduated, he's already in the list, and his company is worth multiple millions of dollars. So what you're looking at here is it started with children, but this idea can be carried on and can become, like really serious project that can have a real impact in the world. Okay, so the first I showed you was something I started with the students. And so I wanted to find a house. I felt constrained with university because the university, I have to ask permission to my boss every time. I have to beg for money. Everything is super slow. I need to get approval for everybody. So I felt restricted with the university. So I started my own company that I call Makerbay. And I wanted this place to be a place where arts and science, design and engineering could be in the same place, when nobody is going to think, oh, you're an artist, so you cannot do this, or you're a scientist, so you cannot be creative. I wanted to have a place where nobody would be able to tell you these kind of things. So I didn't have a lot of money. So the first time I did it, I just found an abandoned chicken farm in the north of Hong Kong. But the problem is that nobody came because it was too far. So it was a really cool place, but it just was too far from anybody to go. And then I found an investor who was crazy enough to trust me. And we built this first big makerspace in Hong Kong, where you have woodwork, metalwork, electronics and precision manufacturing, digital fabrication with laser cutter and 3D printers. But we also had a biohacker space. We also had an acoustic lab, an optics lab, material science rigs. So basically, you could come here, and it doesn't matter if you're a fashion designer, or if you're an architect, or if you're an engineer, any kind of engineer, you could basically prototype your idea there. And so that became a little paradise for me, a place where people could create anything and anything that they like. And very quickly, I realized that if you have the ability to make anything, it can also be very confusing. What do you want to do if you have all these tools? And so we set the mission of Makerbay to be focused on social and environmental issues. And so this makerspace became the first in the world to be a makerspace purely focused on social and environmental impact. And so what we did is that we started to work with refugees, for example, like retraining them. If they come from Africa, maybe they were craftsmen, but they don't know anything about coding for CNC. Or maybe they were plumbers, but they don't know anything about acoustics or fluid dynamics. And so we can teach them like more advanced skills. And so like that, in a couple of years, we did hundreds of projects, but some of them were very futuristic. So Formula E came to Hong Kong, and then we proposed to be the Formula E education partner. And so Formula E is this electric race car. And we proposed them to make, for example, like an education program to teach people not just to be consumer, but to be creators. And so with a group of students, so one software engineer students, one mechanical engineering student, one designer student, an artist student, some software students, we set ourselves to build from scratch the first self-driving car in Hong Kong. And we also wanted to be like as futuristic as possible. And so the students basically learn in 3 months all the skills, and they built the first self-driving car in Hong Kong from scratch. And so you can see here, that's the making of. And this is the car. So when you're approaching the car doesn't have a front and doesn't have a back. It recognizes you based on your Bluetooth signal. So you recognize that you have a Bluetooth device in your pocket, and one of the doors will open the closest to the signal. It doesn't have a steering wheel, doesn't even have a chair, no seatbelt. You can sit anywhere in the car, and you could sleep, or you could do yoga, you could have your breakfast, you could watch a movie, you could do whatever you want. And it just takes you to your next appointment on your Google Calendar, or you can give it a voice command. So that's a really crazy futuristic car. And of course, it's completely illegal. So we couldn't drive it in the city, but we could drive it in the private property of the science park, because it's technically a private property. So we closed off a couple of roads in this mini city, and then we drove around. It attracted a lot of attention from a lot of like car companies, because actually we projected in the future it would be way safer to let robots drive than to let humans drive. And so if robots are driving, then this design makes complete sense. Right now, it doesn't make any sense. It's the future. But in the future, where robots are way safer drivers than humans, then this might be a vision for the future. So because of this, I was invited to create a new department of design in the University of Hong Kong. And I basically developed what is slowly becoming inside of the Department of Architecture. So there's a Department of Architecture and Design is just one of the class, but it's growing now year on year, hiring always more faculties. And we tackle on projects all the way from designing space habitat for living on Mars, all the way to designing for refugee camps that are with refugees in Cox's Bazar. So we found, for example, a nonprofit in Cox's Bazar that are working with refugees. And then I would get my architecture students in HKU to talk to actual refugees and asking them how they can design something that would be useful for them immediately. Goes from designing toilet doors, because in refugee camp, you can imagine you have a problem with managing human waste, all the way to designing education sets for children that can't go to school because they're in a refugee camp, or technical device for how do you say, like when there's a flood, the water goes and everything is starting to crumble. So it can be very, very technical as well. And because we're doing all this humanitarian work, we got the attention of the Jockey Club. They're saying, we want to give you money because you're doing all this work with refugees and homeless people, and also like super high-tech futuristic stuff, but we only give money to nonprofits. Back then, we are still set up as a social enterprise. And they said, well, we will give you money if you're a nonprofit. So we also created a nonprofit, which is Make-A-Bay Foundation. So Make-A-Bay Foundation still exists. It's very active. It's actually keep growing. And we created 6 mini maker spaces in the poorest area of Hong Kong. So now we train the people who have the least access normally in Hong Kong to robotics, coding, and this kind of like future design, and trying to really put in the hands of people the tools to imagine their own future and develop their agency using these new technologies. So that was the first project. The other one, I'm going to go much faster. Okay, so I'm half Japanese. I know it's hard to tell from my face. I'm half Japanese. And maybe you remember there was a big accident in Fukushima a couple of years ago, and there was a big nuclear leak. And recently, the Japanese authority, TEPCO, the national power supplier, they decided to release nuclear waste into the ocean. To be honest, there was always a leak coming out of this nuclear power plant. It's just now it's more regulated, which is probably a good thing. So I'm being half Japanese, and one of my young cousin, who was 21 when the nuclear accident happened, and 1 year later, he's living 100 kilometers away from nuclear power plant. He developed testicular cancer. So I was very upset that somebody from my family who lived next to the power plant developed cancer, 2 years after the nuclear power plant had the problem. So he survived the cancer treatment. He's still okay. But I wanted to know, because the Japanese government, unfortunately, was not very transparent with the radiation report, and they did not share with the local resident the radiation level in some of the area. And so I was very angry, like a lot of Japanese people, about what was going on there. So I organized 3 campaigns to measure myself radioactivity. So the first time, because the roads were broken after the earthquake, I just take a bicycle and I cycle from Tokyo all the way to Sendai. So it's 800 kilometers. So I cycle myself and I carry a radioactivity sensing device called Geiger counter. And every 15 minutes, I will stop down and I will measure radioactivity, and I will write my measurement on a map. Then I will enter all of this into a spreadsheet, and I created a map. So that was my first time. That was right after the nuclear accident, no roads. The second time, the roads were repaired, and I organized a second campaign. We go by car, and then we can go all around the nuclear power plants. The third time, I wanted to know how much radioactivity there is at the bottom of the sea, because Japan reopened the fisheries, and they wanted to say it's safe to eat the sushi from Fukushima. So please export more fish from Fukushima. So they give incentives for the fishermen to go and fish next to Fukushima. So I was very worried that Japan is exporting radioactive fish. So I connect with the local fishermen, and together with them, we organized this campaign of measuring radioactivity just around the nuclear power plants. So I developed a device which is a surface sediment sampler. Most sediment sampler, they catch the sediment deep in the water. They are typically coring devices. The problem is that you mix old sediment, which is not radioactive, with recent sediment. In this case, that will be much more radioactive. So I wanted to have a device that would just skim the surface, and this device did not exist. So I developed this device, and you can see the Fukushima is right behind us. We are 1.5 kilometers away from the nuclear power plant, and you see they are doing repairs. It is not legal to go on land at 30 kilometers away from the power plant. So fishermen are much, much more exposed because the government wants to restart the fishery. So we measure radioactivity, and then we take it into the lab to analyze the size of the grains of sand and measure it. And then we found actually the radioactivity was not as bad as we expected, thankfully, thank God. So radioactivity around Fukushima is not as bad as you might be worried, but we still want more transparency. I think people should know what they are eating. It should not be something that is so difficult to ask for, like, please just tell me that what I'm eating is not contaminated. So this is called citizen science, and I've been a big advocate for more than 10 years. Next project is Ocean Imagineer. So Hong Kong, where I've been based for about almost 9 years, is in a location called the Pearl River Delta. The Pearl River Delta, this whole region of Shenzhen and Guangzhou area, is called Pearl because there used to be a bazillion oysters in the place. And these oysters are what make pearls. And this is why the whole region is called the Pearl River Delta. However, recently, the Chinese party decided to rename this area to be called the Greater Bay. So this is more a political agenda, but the geological name is the Pearl River Delta. And arguably, the first industry ever in Hong Kong was pearl farming. So and this is why the name is Pearl River Delta, because this is where the pearls come from. And so, unfortunately, in the last 80 years, then the industrialization has transformed this area in the factory of the world, which is great. I mean, it's uplifted many people from poverty, but the environment has been badly damaged. And oysters have almost entirely disappeared from the Pearl River Delta. And in the case of Hong Kong, they are only cultivated in one tiny area called La Foshan. And there are only a handful of oyster farmers that are there. And the youngest is over 60. So this is what we call a sunset industry. Every 2 years, they have to rebuild the whole farm because it's made out of bamboo. But because of COVID, they could not rebuild the oyster farms, and Chinese workers could not come to Hong Kong because of the lockdown. And so the oysters, they were now suspended on ropes, were all overweighting on the bamboo structure, and many of them were falling down, and then they are suffocating in their own feces because it's full of mud, because now there's such a concentration of oysters in one tiny area, which is just for cultivation, that they will fall literally in their poop, and they will suffocate. So I was looking with my students for ways that we can build many more oyster farms very fast at a very cheap cost and without producing more waste. So we found that we use bamboo from construction. So these are scaffolding, and we reassemble them as oyster farm with a larger platform. So it's easier even for an older oyster farmer to lift off those oysters. But what we found later during this experiment is that the real bottleneck is not so much the oyster farm, but it's the feedstock. They don't have any oyster babies. So a year later, I worked with the oyster farmer and the Hong Kong University Marine Biology, and we built an oyster hatchery. So this is a place where oysters have babies. We take the water from the ports, we feed them, we remove all the diseases and remove all the animals that will be eating the predators of the oysters. And we get the oyster to have the perfect temperature, flow, and amounts of food. Basically, it's a nursery for oyster babies. And that's what we do mostly under in cages and inside in tanks. And while we're doing this, I was really afraid because we were supposed to deploy this giant oyster, which is basically a piece of art with Kay Wong, which is a local artist that I worked with. But I was afraid that if there's a typhoon, the typhoon will break our installation and our batteries will fall in the water and the battery will leak and basically pollute the area even more. And so this is when I started to think, well, what kind of battery could be a zero impact battery? Because if our platform gets destroyed by a typhoon, what is the kind of battery that will have zero impact on the water? And I couldn't find anything until I stumbled upon hydrogen storage. And so I thought, okay, maybe if I store my electricity in a hydrogen form, water is H2O, hydrogen and oxygen. So if I make a hydrogen battery, then I don't need to worry if it falls in the water. And so we started to produce a bit of hydrogen. So that was the experiment. And because of this, a year later, I moved to Singapore. So that was last year. And I enrolled into an MIT competition that was happening in Indonesia. This one, I thought, if I can produce a small amount of hydrogen on this big oyster farm, could I produce a small amount enough that is useful for fishermen in Indonesia? Because actually, if I look at the energy bill, it's very little that they use. They use maybe a little bit of gas for cooking their food. There's a little bit of electricity to charge their phone and the fans in the house, but they don't even have an AC for like most of them because their fishermen are, usually very poor. And so I went in Indonesia, and with a team of about 10 people, which was an ad hoc team from the competition, we designed this thing. The idea is, imagine if the fishermen actually, they don't use a lot of energy, but it still is a big part of the expenses because they have the electricity for the home, they have the gas for cooking, and they also have the gas for their cars or their motorbikes. What if they could produce their own hydrogen and then store the hydrogen themselves and even sell it? So imagine you're a fisherman, you go outside, and the same way that you put your cages, for example, your nets, you put your floating solar panel and your empty tanks. You go to fish, and during your day, the solar panel will produce, with the water and electrolysis, they will produce a small amount of hydrogen. You don't have much money for a big tank, but you transport them in those flexible tanks, like yoga balloons. And those can be transported and sold around. And they can be basically like a retail sort of small market. And you can use this hydrogen for making electricity, your gas, and also for your transportation. So that's a small amount, I know, but it's actually enough, not for the air conditioning, not enough for your motorbike, but it's enough actually to cook your food and enough to light up your house and charge your phone. That's no problem. And the beauty of this is that it's circular. You can do this over and over again. So I'm now in the process of trying to imagine a facility, because I don't expect everybody to do this, but what if you do this at a village scale? Could we have for many coastal communities, they spend so much money to run generators, which typically run on diesel. So the people who are the poorest tend to spend the highest bill for electricity. If you are in Singapore or somewhere else, your electricity bill is actually a very small amount of your bill. If a very small amount of your expenses. If you live in an isolated place, it can be very, very expensive. Before last project, I'd like to tell you, this is the project I've just done with John. So in the future, imagine Singapore is mostly, sea level is rising. A place like Sentosa, they are in the process of building the world's largest aquarium. 100 years from now, when the water has risen more than 1 meter, which is what we expect in the case of Singapore, it's going to be a disaster. Their installation could be on the water. So imagine an aquarium, instead of being a building, it's a floating structure. A floating structure is expensive to make, no doubt. So what if instead of keeping the fish inside, captive, we are the humans inside of the aquarium, and then we do all we can to create an environment to attract the fish from outside. So the fish is free, and we humans are observing them. So I guess it's a feeding place basically for the animal for most of them. So we propose this vision to the students, and first they go and visit the aquarium, and also you see the back room. How do they actually make the animal reproduce? How do they produce the feed, like the algae so they understand the job of an aquarist, the people who look after the fish. And then the student came up with all sorts of ideas how you could build a floating aquarium that attracts the fish. And they proposed this amazing vision of how they could attract different species by creating different types of environments. If you want to attract turtles, you need a beach. If you want to attract, for example, like dolphins or some other animals, then it's good that you have like a, kelp. So it creates a habitat where they can hide and play. So they create all sorts of habitat, and then they get real feedback from the professional aquarists. So it was amazing to see those discussions between young people that think about the future and aquarists that actually know how this would work. And oftentimes the feedback was that this is really interesting. We never thought about it. We would love to actually, start to investigate that kind of stuff. And then the last, this is a project I've done in just in the Philippines. So I wanted to ask the people, the young people who live in a small coastal town, if the imagination for the future, if they could imagine that they would have to, again, the city would be taken over by sea level rise, which is going to be the case, by the way. We expect that hundreds of millions of people will have to become a climate migrant. What would they do? If they have a floating city, how can they envision it? And so we started by the people who are the poorest. First, we work with the trash collectors or some of the volunteers that help to do the beach cleanup. And then we work with them, we volunteer with them, and then we ask them, in this, this hypothetical future, which is not so hypothetical actually, what would you do? And we ask indigenous people who have been here for generations, and who still have a super close connection with the environment. And then we start to make drawings, and they make those beautiful drawings, and they can totally imagine. Some of them, they didn't go to school, but they can totally imagine what the future could be like. So, for example, they imagine, because they have some of them have a hotel business. They imagine I would have an underwater hotel. Or the young people, they say, we love the environment, but there's no jobs in conservation. What if we could have jobs in conservation by creating this infrastructure for ecotourism? So they imagine that they have this giant submarine and they can take the tourists to observe wildlife in this, futuristic transportation. And these are amazing two gentlemen. They actually have been recognized by the government to be victims of torture because they oppose the construction of the coal power plants because they know that it would destroy the environment. And they fought against the authority and they were thrown in prison. They were physically tortured. So they came out of prison and now they're still fighting to have green energy in their village. And this young man here, unfortunately, when he was 6 years old, he was abandoned by his parents. His parents were too poor. So he became an orphan when he was 5 or 6, and he had to fend for himself. So he started working on a fishing vessel at the age of 6. And he was saying that he was terrified because some nights, he was a storm and he was still having to be outside and he was fearing for his life. So he was saying if there was a city in the sea, he hoped that they can be, very safe, like shelters for young fishermen, especially like himself. And so we ask people, what do you want for the future? And if you ask them, people can tell you what they wish for the future. And it's something that people don't spend much time thinking about. But if you do ask them, they totally know what they want. And so we came up with this basically city with all these functions to support people in their future. And it was done by the side of the beach under a big tree. It's not having a lot of money. It's not having a lot of resources. It's basically putting the time and the method to actually activate this. And then we created a repertoire, a big folder with each of the drawings, each of the model, and what they imagine this means. And then we created a high resolution version of each of these designs, and we assembled this into a massive architecture model. And just a few months back, we installed this massive floating city in the middle of the Mine Museum, which is the biggest science museum in the Philippines. And they put this in the timeline of the future of transportation, from the very first boat, which is a raft, all the way to, future things like the International Space Station. So you have the International Space Station, and then you have the International Ocean Station, which is what we presented here. And the idea is that the International Ocean Station is close to us, accessible. The space station is so far out there, and it's very elitist. Only a few countries can use this. And actually, Russia pulled out of the International Space Station recently for political reasons. So we had an opening, and many people, they are commenting on this on social media. But the vision is this, is that International Ocean Station, instead of having one, we should have many of them. They are low cost, so we can have many of them. They can be inclusive. Even a poor country, let's say like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, coastal communities that are going to be hugely impacted by sea level rise, can actually use this kind of infrastructure to imagine the future and how they respond to climate change. So this is my closing point for the young people here. When you're thinking about the future as a young person, oftentimes adults especially people who think they are smart and they know so much, are the people who be the fastest to dismiss your crazy idea and they tell you your ideas is too big or too imaginative. Don't listen to them, because literally our future depends on your imagination. We know, sorry for my French, but adults have fucked up. Like, we've destroyed this planet for the most part, and it's going to be your job, unfortunately, to fix it. And so if you don't have imagination, if you are not, if you're afraid of believing in your own dreams, then don't trust the adults who believe in your own dreams. We need you to go out and explore and think about the future and be bold and be courageous and try those different things. So yeah, so that's my closing is please never lose the imagination and never let anybody tell you that your dreams are too big. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have a question from Cesar in the chat. It says, do you see potential for the EU project Pavilion to expand to Asia Pacific?
Sorry, I didn't. EU Parivalon. I don't know what this Parivalon is, so I'm gonna share my screen and I'm gonna look it up with you. Okay, let me see. Parivalon. Okay, right here. You see my screen? Okay, Parivalon. What is this? European Territory for Organized Environmental Crime through Intelligent Threat Detection. Okay. Yes, that looks good. I don't know about the project, so I can't really comment on it. But the idea, my understanding, is to use, like, I guess, satellites to, like, look at environmental crimes. I'm not sure. I don't know.
If I may, basically, as you can imagine, it's very difficult to keep track of vessels dumping toxic materials, but also professional dumpsters who collect industrial waste and dump them into the sea and in many other
Right.
locations. And it's a cat and mouse game. So this project
Right.
is aiming to enlist both satellite and several other reconnaissance systems and sensors to detect it, but it is part of a bit of a bigger network. So, so sometimes, usually I guess the culprits do not just travel around the shores of Europe, but, travel the
Yeah.
seven seas. So perhaps the
That's right.
seven seas enforcement oversight. And then I would
Right.
very much like to learn your intellectual and creative perspective on this project. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thanks a lot. I didn't have this project on my radar, so I'm definitely going to look it up. But definitely, I see this as a very useful thing. Detecting crime, I think it's now it's increasingly easy. I think the enforcement is the really hard part. So I believe that this is a really good step in the right direction. I was reading in social media how we're also using this, for example, for tracking the illegal vessels. Illegal vessel, I think, I mean, it's the worst name I could give to it. It's basically people, for example, like fleeing the coast of Africa, trying to cross the Mediterranean, and that are being, actively abandoned or being sunk. And I think we'll look back in history and, because we will have all this data. So we know that we are, mass killing many people that we've committed to help. And we are letting criminals, run free. So I think, yeah, I'm sure it's possible to detect. What I'm not sure is our willingness and how much resource we are willing to put behind the enforcement. But yeah, I'm definitely favorable to have a better oversight.
Okay.
You want to select the question for me?
Yeah. So the question from Patricia is, how are these projects sponsored financially, and
Yes.
how can you replicate these processes and opportunities?
Good question. So all of these projects, they have different different source of funding. So maybe I'll look at some projects to give you an example. Maybe okay, just to, if I go back to the sort of table of contents, so I could figure like which project is funded how. So for example, the Core Robot, it started as a primary school project. And I think the school had given my class maybe $300 to build this laser quadrat. MakerBay was self-funded, so it's an entrepreneurial endeavor. Fukushima seafloor mapping was sponsored by SafeCast, which is a small nonprofit. Ocean Imagineer was funded by it was an art project, but we used most of the money for the scientific developments within university and building the floating platform. Floating solar hydrogen is completely self-started. I just think that super has a huge potential. So I put my own money, my own personal savings into it. Aquarist was paid by the aquarium, so there was like a consulting project. International Ocean Station is like a lifelong arts project that I've found different funding applied for. So it really varies, like every project is different, but they all have in common that I never wait for the money to start the project. I always start the project first. And once you have some prototype or something, this is when you can get money. Nobody will believe you unless you believe in yourself, and then you do the first step. So I've never got any money when I just do a proposal based on like an idea. I always take the first step because people would believe you if you start to make the first step, but they generally don't want to be the one taking the risk. So you have to take the risk first.
So how do you think that we can replicate these processes and opportunities?
Okay, I think you can replicate this methodology I have anywhere you are on so many different projects. My methodology is very simple. I would say it's even simpler than the design thinking method. Usually, what we do, for example, like design thinking, we say there's like 5 steps. In my opinion, there's like 3 steps. The first step is the heart, is get people to care. So that's why I get my students in polluted sites and I make them suffer. I make them experience firsthand the problem. If it remains a cerebral thing, there's no buy-in. They will not put the effort to work because they don't care, and I don't blame them. First, we need people to care. Second is to use your hands. We get your hands dirty. Don't read the books about it. Trying to do something about it. Trying to do something about it. Get your hands dirty, and then the brain. So I would say heart, hand, brain. If you're a teacher, I know this is hard to take the risk to take your students out in a polluted site or something like this, but the benefit of it is so huge. Of course, you do it responsibly. And also be ready that most experiments will fail. I showed you experiment that worked, but of course, most of the experiment will fail. But this is exactly what we can teach our students, not how to do an experiment that works, but learn to fail, to fall down, and then to stand back up. Just the act of standing back up is more important than the experiment. If we can teach our students to have this attitude to fail and stand back up, this is the biggest lesson they can ever learn in their life, is that there will be hardship, but we as a team, we're standing back up and continue to protect, continue to try, continue to test. So yeah, so I would say choose something that is real and that you feel personally affected by, that you feel it's important, and then trying to do something about it. You're going to learn everything.
Thank you. So I have a question. What was the most challenging part of building Ocean Futures?
Of Ocean Futures?
Yes.
Well, the first step I would say that most people don't realize how important the ocean is. So whatever you do in the ocean, people are thinking like, oh, that sounds like some woo-woo cool stuff. The planet is 70% covered with the ocean. The ocean absorbs 90% of the excess heat that we put out there. So the ocean literally controls the climate. So the ocean absorbs 90% of the heat of the sun as well, and redistributed through the ocean currents. So when you do something in the ocean, the ocean is the biggest lever we have to affect climate change. If we do something that can improve, say, the rate of reproduction of, say, plankton, that seems like such a nerdy, specific thing to do. But plankton produce more oxygen than all the trees in the world. So people don't realize how important the ocean is. So that's the first thing that is hard. The second is that the ocean is dangerous and it's a complicated place and it's incredibly diverse as well. So it's, it's a topic that most people don't understand, even though it's the most important topic in my opinion, or I mean, the most important environment, at least. So yeah, so I would say it's a hostile, complex, and huge environment that typically people overlook. So you need to overcome a lot of these barriers before people even start to get interested in what you do, because it's a difficult environment.
Thank you. So there's a question. What is your favorite part about working on such projects?
I mean, life is short, right? So I probably won't see a lot of the results of my efforts even before I pass away, because the ocean is so large. The impact that we can have on such a big system is always going to be, it's gonna take a very long time. In recent research that I read, like because of the heat that's accumulated in the ocean, like the climate change of 1.5 is basically baked in. Even if we reduce everything to zero even today, we're not going to make the 1.5 degree goal of the COP21. So for me, if I attach myself to the results, then I'll be miserable every day, right? Like if I attach myself to how much coral reef I can save, knowing that so many coral reef are going to be dying based on the physics of how much heat there is trapped in the ocean, then I would kill myself, right? Like it's so disheartening. So, but then you also have a duty. If you know that you have such a big battle, you cannot fight the battle just for yourself, right? So I know that the battle I'm fighting is a battle for the ages. It's a battle for many generations to come. And so I feel elated. I feel so incredibly happy that I know that I'm doing something that is right. That is something that's going to be useful, which is not just useful for me, but it's going to be useful for many generations to come. There's no way to describe how satisfied I can be when I work on something that I know that is meaningful and much bigger than myself. I would describe this almost like a spiritual experience when you don't think just for yourself, but you think of many generations. So for me, being able to contribute even a tiny, tiny part, because I know whatever I do will be so small, but being a tiny voice in this symphony of change that the world needs to hear. For me, this is incredibly satisfying, no matter how small the things that I do, because you know the truth of what you do in the small personal history fits in that big history and this big change that must happen. So that's why I feel so happy and excited to work on that stuff, because no matter how small, I know it's contributing to this bigger picture.
Thank you for sharing. So if you have any more questions, you can drop in the chat or unmute and ask. If not, I also have another question. What was most common comments from the students that were in the projects that you mentioned?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Sorry. So what comments do you get the most from the students in your project?
The students, my students, for example, like Sidant, who studied Clearbot, very pragmatic. He's saying like, Cesar, I love to work on saving corals, but then how can I make money? They were like, I would love to make this into a job, but how do I make this into a job? So, nature, if you save a tree, the tree is not going to give you money. I mean, actually, it's not true. Like you could cut the tree later and sell it for money. but the students, they when they come to my class, they're excited about it. And there are many ways you could actually monetize those skills that you learn. So I was mentioning like one of my students, he's in Forbes 30 under 30. There are many ways, and I would argue that climate tech is going to be the biggest industry in the future. Like when climate changes, all these adaptation technology for having better insulation material for the house, use less energy. What I'm working on now, the floating solar hydrogen, I would argue that those are going to be gigantic money-making machines. So I think there's a sense right now, the old thinking is that, oh, if you're doing something for the environment, you're some like tree hugger and you're going to be broke all your life. But that's increasingly untrue. Increasingly, there are many, many opportunities for people who are doing stuff that's related to the environment, and there's going to be more and more money into this as well. So that means that doing something good is also going to be good for you financially. So I think young people need to sort of abandon this old idea that maybe your parents and your grandparents will tell you, like, don't be a tree hugger. But actually, there's a lot of opportunity and there's so many jobs now in the green industries. So I hope young people see that and they're excited about that, and they will be the change.
If there are no more questions, does anyone have any do you have any closing words for all the futurists here today?
All right. Thank you very much. Okay. That's it. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cesar. I think ocean futures is a relatable topic to many youth, and there will be some takeaways and hopefully some follow-up questions and ways that we can interact with our youth and replicate some of the wonderful things you all are doing. Does John have any closing thoughts? Come on in, John.
Hi, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing, Cesar, and thank you, Teach the Future internationally, for letting us in Singapore open our Singapore hub today. So I'm so glad my daughter can be part of this, and Cesar and Edmund before. And also next up, we have Louis, who's going to also be speaking. And it's just a great joy to be part of World Futures Day today.